All right, the Masters of the Black Gaze are back, and yeah, they've got a really interesting one with this one. So let's dive in. Infinite Granite by Deafheaven. So Deafheaven came at a time when like black metal and shoegaze were starting to like court one another. These two styles of music that you would normally think don't really jam all that well really started to come to the forefront. They put out their first album in 2011 with Rose to Judah. I think a lot of people can say that one of their best albums followed it up with Sunbather. Then from there, they came to New Bermuda. And honestly, I came onto the scene in 2018 with Ordinary Corrupt Human Love. That album was the one that gave me the introduction to them. And I love the blending of the shoegaze, like post-rock kind of sense with this really tech death metal and black metal kind of sprout throughout it. So you have those blast beats, heavy hitting, chuggy guitars with the screaming vocals blended with this almost dream-like vocal sequence with very subtle and noodly guitars. There's very little bombasticness in it. And I love that kind of jam. I love that dichotomy because this allowed both facets of the music to really, really shine. Those more somber, soft, and personal moments were made that much brighter because of all the darkness and sludge that you had to go through. And that darkness and sludge became that much more brutal based off of all that heavenly sounds that we had. So the two paired very, very well together. And now we come to Infinite Granite with their latest album. And they've kind of done away with a lot of the black metal, death metal aspects of this album. Really, there are only 3 instances on this album that really take that black metal or even metal proper. And even those 3 tracks are very, very small in the actual runtime of the tracks themselves, where it becomes a little bit more death metal, black metal in that sense. This album overall is much more somber, much more pastel, I think would be a good word for this, while still allowing the music to have a little bit of an oomph. Like, it's not completely toothless in being nothing but those more ambient sounds, more crescendo rock. You know, we're looking at like Explosion in the Sky and even Mogwai, all those post-rock kind of outfits, while still having just a hair of the teeth within it. But really the main focus of this album is that softer side of music to allow the music to really build and grow. The first couple of tracks, Shell Star and In Blur, do very, very well of opening up this album. They both have a very satisfying build and crescendo. And the one thing that I do appreciate for this one that they were trying out within past albums are when the vocals are very soft and somber, it's almost lost in the mix. And I know some people wouldn't necessarily like that all that much, but what it does is, because all the music mixing is relative, like one aspect of the song is louder because another aspect is quieter, it does feel like the tracks themselves are a little bit more chaotic due to that order of the vocals being a little bit further down in the mixing. Now, again, I know a lot of people might not like this. They want to hear the vocals front and center. But for a person like me that really has the vocals and lyrics as an instrument, so that the lyrics itself are more of like a second or third aspect to it, like the actual lyrics themselves are more of like a musical instrument that takes on the form of sounds. I much prefer the actual like shape of the lyrics themselves. And so because it's a little bit buried, it provides a little bit more of a bigger scope to the music itself. And I also think that the first track of Shell Star does a really good job of like opening up the album and introducing the audience to what's going to be expected within the actual music itself. It does a great job of starting off very somber and building itself into a couple crescendos and kind of wrapping everything up. I will admit that the second track of In Blur reminds me very much of a Coldplay song of either Vida La Vida or something from their Moxiloto, like those two albums, in having a little bit more of the synth sound that has like it's it's a strange specific sound that Coldplay was using on those two albums that is really put in here, and the actual essence itself feels like some of those more somber and soft tracks from those two albums. Then we come into the great mass of color, and this one is one of the few tracks where you can hear screaming in it. Now it is buried very much in the mix, and so it is much more of like a screaming into the darkness. You don't quite hear it all that much. Now it doesn't quite have that same like grip and teeth that Ordinary Corrupt Human Love or Sunbather did, but it still has a little bit more of an oomph than the first two tracks. And really, it isn't until like the very last couple of seconds that it comes in, and it's more of a harmonization to the main vocals. Again, you have to really look for it. From there, we come into the very soft and somber, almost interlude track of Neptune Raining Diamonds. And it really is just kind of a floating piece, very similar to some of the more somber tracks that we would get from Mogwai, that then lead us right into Lament for Wasps. And I really enjoyed this track. It's the second longest track, next to the last track, and it really takes its time to build. And this is one of my favorite moments on the album, of the plateau that this track is able to reach when we get to that midpoint. It's heavenly, it's somber, it's reminding me of some of the big builds that we would have from, say, like Sigur Rós, or maybe not to the same extent as some of the more post-rock and metal stuff that we would have from like Godspeed You Black Emperor, but at least that kind of crescendo near the end point, it really does come to a very satisfying conclusion. And then from there we come into the sixth song of Villain, and I feel like at Villain, you're either in the album or you're really not, because like a lot of the playing styles in terms of the guitar works are very, very similar. They're reaching the same chord range within the same sounds that they've put on it, so there's not a whole lot of variety within Villains. But if you're in that track and you're in this kind of hypnotic state that the album has lulled you into, this is a great progression along with the runtime proper. The big build that we get to at the end, the big crescendo, is really meaty, and we reach our second point where there's some growls. This time it's a little bit more on the forefront, so it's almost as though this monster has been chasing you through this very pastel, happy, sunny field, and you're starting to catch wisps of anxiety throughout it, and you can only kind of see the hints of it. And so I like the fact that they're holding their cards back a little bit and not providing this massive, like, guttural approach, but there's still enough teeth in there to keep you roping along. But as I said, if you're really into that kind of heavy, bombastic black metal, you're probably going to be tapping out at this point, especially because of how repetitious Villain can feel after the Great Massive Colors and Lament for Wasps, because it does feel very similar to those two tracks. And in fact, the Gnashing, the seventh track, it feels very similar to the last track from Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, which was Worthless Animals. And I feel like they really love that style of playing. When I reviewed Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, I did say that Worthless People, or Worthless Animals, or it might even be Night People, it reminded me of Radiohead's Big Boots, or whatever they called it. It might still be Big Boots. It was the track that they left off of OK Computer because it was never finished. But it has that dun, 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 dun. Like it's got this dun, 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 kind of a note sequence in it, and it does feel kind of like it was lifted right off of Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, even when that was ripped off of some of the demos that were felt from OK Computer. When I'm in the album proper and I've kind of let the music kind of wash over, it kind of lulls it into the next track of Other Language, because it's not all that offensive. There's not enough to really kind of grab my attention, though. So by the time we get into Other Language, I do like where the track goes. And again, I love the kind of crescendo. I'm a diehard fan of anything that has a really nice and satisfying build. I love a great resolution to a nice climb. And again, I'm a sucker for crescendos. So this track does that very well, and it elevates the overall track very, very nicely. And then we come into the last one of Mombias. and I think that's how you pronounce it, Mambayas. And I really don't have anything else to say about Mambayas that hasn't already been said about the other tracks, outside of the fact that it ends with the screams. It ends with the big crescendo of more of that black metal. And even though this is probably the heaviest and the darkest moments of the album, it still doesn't really feel as heavy or hard-hitting as any other moments from their past albums. Like, they did keep the overall album very soft and somber, which I'm fine with. I think that's a great thing. But with a band with a legacy that does dip its toe so heavily within the black metal aspect of it, I really wish that the last track that I believe this entire album is building towards really came hard-hitting and left nothing at the door. I do feel like they left quite a bit at the door by the end there, but because it is the hardest point, it does contrast very well with the rest of the album, not only the softer points at the beginning part of this track. This is where we've got the screams, this is where we've got the really great blast beats, and I do feel like that anxiety that was felt within Villain and the great massive colors, I feel like that's where it's realized, and you're starting to realize the horror of it all. It's still not quite as hard-hitting as I was really hoping that it was, but it's still a very satisfying end to this album with a nice punctuation mark at the end. So overall, I have to say that Infinite Granite was still a very good time. Usually when I come to metal music, I love the contrasts, and that was one of the things that I really did appreciate and love about Ordinary Corrupt Human Lung and Sunbather. I will say, and it's interesting, I feel like start to finish this is a better album than Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, but no track on this album was nearly as good as the 1-2 punch of Honeycomb and Canary Yellow. So that's kind of where I'm at this point of the album. I still feel like every time I sit down and listen to this album, I'm still rewarded with a very pleasant and very beautiful listen. So if you came to this album expecting for lots of death metal, lots of black metal, you're going to be disappointed because this one is a lot more somber and a lot more soft. And honestly, I think that's kind of what we're needing right now. I can do with a little bit of a pastel listen. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. At the end of the day, I will say that Infinite Granite by Deafheaven is one that I would still pick up in physical format. Because, as I mentioned, the full runtime, the full, 53 minutes from start to finish, is still a extremely pleasant listen. At no point do I feel like there's a lag in this album. At no point do I feel like there's a drop-off of my attention on it. It holds my attention for the entire runtime. And honestly, if you get to about track 4 on this and you aren't invested in it, then this album's probably not going to be for you. But if you're like me and you made it all the way to the end and it was a very satisfying one, then yeah, you're going to really, really enjoy this one. But that's all I got for Infinite Granite by Deafheaven. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've left a link down below. Even $1 a month goes a long way. You get your name at the end credits, and depending on the tier that you donate in, you get album reviews, you get live streams, you get some really nice perks. And if you want to see more of me, I've got my podcast of Quid Prog Quo. You can either watch that on YouTube or catch it wherever you can listen to your podcasts. And that's all I've got. That's all I've got. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.